Hey guys, I find it rather ironic that I've just now decided to switch the whole way in which I record these videos to better have window light. So 43 videos later, I finally figured that one out. You might notice my lovely princess paraphernalia here. The reason is we're getting ready to discuss the Kennedy administration, which a lot of people call the Camelot period in American history, when we had a young emperor like Camelot and his beautiful wife, Jackie Kennedy, and the whole country seemed united under their leadership and very much engaged and besotted with them in terms of finding them absolutely fascinating and lovely. And we'd had Eisenhower for 2 terms, an older grandfatherly type figure, and so now to have small children in the White House, and it really kind of brought excitement and youth to the nation. And so that Camelot reference leads me to don my royal garb. We're going to be looking, let's head straight to the PowerPoint. We're going to be looking at this PowerPoint to help us guide our discussion. And I hope that I have introduced Kennedy in class by now. If I haven't, then I will do a better job of talking about the first question then, and that's the intriguing facts about his background. So, we're also going to talk about the foreign policy crises he dealt with and his main domestic policy initiatives and why the economy did so well while he was president. He's only president for 3 years and is assassinated, and we'll talk about why that might be. And we'll probably talk about that more in class, actually. And then we'll talk about what aspects of the Kennedy era still have relevance today. Okay? So, we refer to John F. Kennedy as JFK, and his vice president was Lyndon Baines Johnson as LBJ. And he serves from 1961 to 1963. And he's our first Catholic president. He was a World War II hero. We'll talk about more in class some of the medical problems he faced. And also the image of his presidency versus the realities of his presidency. Okay? So those are the things we'll talk about in class. Hopefully you've either seen that or I'll spend more time talking about this the next day in class. Okay? So let's move on and talk about the kind of the meat of his administration, which is the election of 1960. His opponent was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon had been Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, and so he was had a lot of credentials in that sense. The debates were really, really important. They debated for the first time ever on national television in the history of presidential elections. And people who heard it on the radio thought that Nixon had won, and people who saw it on TV thought that Kennedy had won. And so what we find is in this new TV era that suddenly how you look becomes extremely important in terms of your presidential success in elections. So we're starting to enter a time when we know that maybe Abraham Lincoln could not have been elected because he just wasn't attractive enough to TV viewers. Once he's inaugurated, he says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So he was very much into the idea of service to one's country. And that's reflected in that quote. Dwight D. Eisenhower had founded NASA, but John F. Kennedy funded it and expanded their funding. He stated in a speech that it was his goal to put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, and this was considered to be a very radical proposal with a very challenging timeline. This was part of the Soviet space race, and if you remember, in the 1950s, the Soviets had kind of lapped us with Sputnik. And so this was John F. Kennedy's kind of counter proposal that he was really not going to give any ground to the Soviets. We do achieve this amazing landmark in 1969. Kennedy, of course, was not alive to see it. Nixon was, but it was John F. Kennedy's initiative that made that a reality. His administration also started out kind of disastrously with something known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. If you remember, this is Cuba off the coast of Florida. It had gone communist when Fidel Castro led the revolution. Well, we had funded and trained exiles from Cuba to overthrow Castro and try and get Castro back under a democratic rule. And most of the exiles from Cuba were richer people, wealthier people, people who were professionals, those kinds of things, because they were the ones who most feared communism. And they had settled in Miami and Florida to a large degree. And really, really were adamant that they wanted to go back and win back their homeland. Well, the invasion was a terrible failure. We didn't give proper air cover because we didn't want our direct involvement to be evident. And so the exiles that went back were quickly put down, and the whole thing was a terrible embarrassment. At that point, JFK had a choice. He could kind of sell out the Eisenhower administration, who had planned the attack, and just say that it had been planned before his administration took office. Or he could take responsibility and say, you know what, this was my call and I made it, and this was an embarrassment. He decided to do the second thing. He took responsibility for the failure and the decision to do the Bay of Pigs invasion, and a lot of people were impressed by that. Somebody who was not impressed by this is Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union. When he sees this and the vulnerability that it seems to place upon the president, he basically does not start to take Kennedy very seriously, and he thinks that we have a young person who doesn't know what they're doing in the office in John Kennedy. So John Kennedy, though, did show his commitment to the Berliners during this time period. The Soviets had continued to be embarrassed by people, if you look here, people fleeing East Berlin and East Germany into West Berlin. And so to stop that public relations problem, the Soviets decided to build a wall around Berlin to stop the defection. So the wall is this black area here. It went all the way around West Berlin, which, if you remember, is embedded in the whole East German sector. There's only an 80-mile road connecting West Berlin with West Germany, democratic and non-communist. Well, Kennedy decides to do something important. He visits Berlin, and this was extremely important in terms of symbolism, but also just showing his commitment to the people of Berlin, and that if they were going to be in jail, as they felt by the wall, and vulnerable, that he would join them inside the wall. And he gave an interesting speech where he said that he was a Berliner, and said that basically he was one of them. What was funny about that is a Berliner in Germany is like a jelly pastry, like a jelly donut. So he basically stood up in front of an adoring crowd and said, "I'm a jelly donut." But people knew his intention, and that it was probably one of the funnier presidential mistakes in a speech that we know of. Soon after that, we discovered that the Soviets are starting to put missiles, sites for nuclear missiles on Cuba that will be aimed at the United States. And we deem this to be totally unacceptable, as they could attack the United States and annihilate great parts of the United States in a matter of 20 minutes. And we saw that they were not only building the sites, but were going to send the missiles to man the sites. And we deemed that this was just unacceptable, that Kennedy did not want our people to live under the specter of instant nuclear attack that would happen almost without warning. So he decided that we would stop the Soviets from delivering the missiles by putting a blockade on Cuba. Now, a blockade is an act of war, so we can't actually call it a blockade. He called it a quarantine, and made speeches in which he not only said that an attack on the United States from Cuba would be deemed an attack by the Soviet Union directly on the United States, and that they would respond in kind. He also warned the American people about, in some very pointed ways, about how they might survive a nuclear attack. And this really raised tensions within the United States, and was the closest we've ever come to nuclear war. The Soviets kept sending their ships, and over a period of 13 days, the negotiations for what was going to happen between us and the Soviets continued to churn. And finally, the USSR turns their ships back rather than trying to break through the blockade, also known as a quarantine. And it makes Kennedy look a lot tougher than they had originally thought. Khrushchev had really underestimated Kennedy and his determination to protect the American people. Secretly, we had promised to remove missiles from Turkey. We had missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. And so it seemed only fair that if they were not going to be able to have missiles in our backyard, that we couldn't have missiles in their backyard. And then also we think there was a secret agreement to never try and invade Cuba again. And this might be really hard news for the exiles from Cuba to hear, and might lead them to be highly dissatisfied with Kennedy as president for that reason. It's the closest we've ever been to nuclear war, and very heightened days of tension in that part or time in the Cold War. Kennedy believed that we needed to fight communism around the world by raising the standard of living, because he knew that poor people with a low standard of living would be more tempted by communism than people who were prospering. And so he comes up with two programs to help. One of them is called the Alliance for Progress. It was basically an aid program to South America, and trying to help build schools, roads, access to clean water, those kinds of things. And it helps increase school attendance in South America and helps kind of bridge some of the hard feelings we had between us and our neighbors to the south based on what we had done during the imperialist era. And yeah, so that was good. Unfortunately, the Alliance for Progress didn't last much longer because of our increasing need to fight in Vietnam. One program that did last and is still around today is the Peace Corps. It was aid to nations, all nations around the entire world. And these were volunteers that would apply, are selected and trained, and they served for 2 years abroad. And this gave a very palpable way for youth to help around the world and be kind of international ambassadors of the United States and involve themselves in service. So both of those were ways in which you could, help raise the standard of living worldwide. He also looked at our military and realized that we were really limited by the amount that we had come to depend upon missiles and our Air Force. And the Hungarian crisis and other things like that had taught us that we really needed a more flexible military that was not so dependent upon just bombs. So since he felt we were relying too much on nukes, he is going to want to diversify our military and use more conventional tactics, as well as come up with specialized fighting forces like the Green Berets. So these are men who are trained kind of on the ground to go into countries. They use conventional weapons, for example. So this is one way in which he diversifies the military, is helping build special forces teams to help supplement our reliance on bombs and the CIA to meet our foreign policy objectives. Okay. We eventually, towards the end of his presidency, we actually get such respect from the Soviet Union that we actually see great gains being made. Suddenly Nikita Khrushchev seems to know that he and Kennedy can play hardball, and that kind of brings everyone to their senses. And so they agree with the Soviets to no longer test bombs above the ground. It's called the Limited Test Ban Treaty. They will, from then on, they'll drill deep holes in the ground and test them in the ground based on the seismic activity that they cause, kind of like you bury a bomb and blow it up, it causes like earthquakes. That's the way they're going to test bombs after that. Today we don't test bombs in either of these ways. We test them via computer simulation alone. So, don't know if you find that reassuring or not, but that's the facts. We also established a hotline between us and the Soviet Union. We were afraid that us and the Soviets might accidentally cause a war by some miscommunication. We might perceive that some explosion that happened was caused by the Soviets and respond in kind. And so they established this thing called the hotline, where it's a phone directly between the White House and the Kremlin. So in case there are any misunderstandings about what's going on in the world, that we can clarify those by this phone line. Kennedy's domestic policies were called the New Frontier. You know, all the presidents had started naming their agendas after Teddy Roosevelt. So you had the Square Deal and the New Deal, and the Eisenhower's was dynamic conservatism. Well, Kennedy's is the New Frontier. Part of this is he's the first president born in the 1900s that becomes president of the United States. So he called that, his domestic agenda was called the New Frontier. It was classic kind of liberalism stuff. He wanted to increase funding for education. He also wanted to help inner cities. We had this white flight from the inner cities that had left. In inner cities increasingly were disproportionately minority and poor. Congress was not in a generous mood, and so they didn't necessarily fund most of these things. So Kennedy's really not known for his domestic achievements. He's more known for the things he did in foreign policy. He is known for having a booming economy while he was president, and this is thanks to his belief in a British economist named John Keynes. John Keynes believes that the presidency and the Congress can affect the economy to a great degree through fiscal policy, which means how they tax and spend. He said that if you want a vibrant economy, you simply need to cut taxes and increase spending. The problem with cutting taxes and increasing spending is that it does cause debt. Keynes didn't see debt as a huge problem. I don't think he had any sense that we would end up with the kind of debt levels that we have today. But John Kennedy did follow this prescription for helping your economy become vibrant, and the 60s were a good time for the economy in general. We'll be talking about his assassination in class, so I'm not going to belabor that point here since our video is already getting pretty long. And I will look forward to seeing you in class and talking more about the Kennedy administration. Okay, see you.